you got to think about why you're starting your podcast, presumably, and you're going to do a podcast related to something about that product or service, which is the area that you know about. It's the area that you're passionate about. It's the areas that you're experienced and you're an expert in. And it's the area where you sell a product or service.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
And we're back with another episode of the podcast on podcasting with your host, Adam A. Adams. That's me. And today we have Matt Bowles on the show. Matt has his own podcast called The Maverick Show. And he's a real estate investor, which is kind of cool. I don't always have real estate investors on the show, Matt. But I, too, am a real estate investor since 2005, and I love it. I've been doing it for a long time. We have tons of apartment units that we manage, and I think real estate is an important venture for all people. And if they're interested in real estate, you've got a show. Do you teach real estate on your show, The Maverick Show?
So the Maverick Show actually is a number of things that are sort of combined. So my company that I own is called Maverick Investor Group, and we help people buy cash flowing rental properties completely turnkey from anywhere in the world. All the properties are in the United States, and they're in the most investor advantaged U.S. real estate markets. They're also turnkey, so they're either new or they're fully renovated, and they already have a tenant and local property management in place. So you cash flow when you close on these properties, and you can own them from anywhere. So that's the business that we offer. And then we built that business so that we could run it with a location independent infrastructure. So in addition to our buyers being able to be anywhere, also, we, the owners of the company and our staff, are also location independent. And so I travel the world. I've lived in probably about 65 different countries since 2013. And as I was traveling around, I was meeting all of these really interesting people. And some of them are real estate investors and they're traveling and living off their passive income. Some of them are location independent business owners and doing really interesting stuff. And so I decided to start the Maverick Show because I was having these incredible conversations with people and I wanted to record them and put them out there. And so the Maverick Show really today is me interviewing today's most interesting real estate investors, entrepreneurs, and world travelers.
A lot of our listeners are planning to have their podcast part of their business, like integrate the podcast as, in a way, almost like the top of the funnel. How do you do that with your show and your business?
Yeah, so the main value, I think, in the podcast is, number one, you're putting yourself out there and you're allowing your listeners to get to know, like, and trust you. And so one of the things that I'm doing in a way that we are positioning and differentiating our company in many ways through the podcast is that we are very interesting in terms of the lifestyle design that we and our staff and our clients are choosing to pursue, right? And so as my guests listen to the show, they get to know, like, and trust me, and they start to follow the show. They start to understand also that I offer this service, right, of helping them buy rental properties. And so any of the listeners of the show, when they're ready to buy rental properties, of course, we are going to be top of mind for them, and they're going to be able to contact us. We also have this sort of promotions on the show that we will mention to them that this is what we do, this is how we help you, this is what we offer, and where they can go to get a free consultation. And the other thing that I do, this I think is actually really important for podcasters to consider. You're not just putting out content for your listeners. The other thing that you want to be conscious of doing is building relationships with your guests if you're doing an interview show. If you're doing an interview show, really prioritize the value of your relationship with your guests. Just today, Adam, before I came on the show with you, I had a podcast guest of mine from 2 weeks ago refer me a real estate investing client, someone that she knows that was talking to her and said, hey, I'm interested in real estate. Do you know anybody that can help me buy that? She said, of course I do. I was just on this amazing podcast. Let me introduce you to Matt. And we're now working with that client.
I really like that. And one of the things that you mentioned is something that I used to really struggle with. And what that was mentioning my business on my podcast. The reason I struggled with it personally, and I believe that some people listening may have the same thoughts, is if I tell people what I do, if I mention it on my podcast, then I'm a complete sellout. I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. I only want to add value. People are going to judge me. So you mentioned that you let your listener know how you can help them go to the next level. How do you do that? Why is it important to do that? And if somebody feels the way that I used to feel, like I shouldn't do this, that's bad, what would you share with that person?
Well, the very baseline thing that you have to do, and this goes for your entire business, regardless of if you're podcasting or not, you have to convince yourself that the product that you are selling or the service that you are selling is so valuable to the person that you're selling it to that you simply are adding value to them by selling them your product or service. Like, you have to be that confident in your product or service. And so that's the first thing, okay? And that's just in sales in general. Any kind of marketing that you're going to do or anything, you have to have that as the foundation. Once you have convinced yourself that your product and service is simply going to improve the lives of anybody that buys it, then you don't feel like you're selling anything. You're simply adding value in the same way as you are when you're interviewing a great guest or you're putting out free educational content or anything like that. And you have to remember, the reason someone is coming to you is because they want what you have. They want your expertise. They want your product or your service or something tangentially related to that initially anyways, right? And so the more that you educate people about the space that you're in, ultimately they want to learn that because eventually they want to buy the product and service that you're offering. And so you just need to understand it in that framework. And if you're having trouble, just go back to the very first step and convince yourself that your product and service is going to add value to anybody that buys it. And that way you don't feel like you're selling anything. You just feel like you're helping people.
That you could drop the mic. We could end the podcast now. That is plenty. Don't actually drop your mic though. We don't want, but I'm listening to you and thinking to myself, that's probably something that many of us struggle with is, if I mention this, I'm going to be a sellout. If I mention this, they're going to think I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. I'm going to get judged. Somebody's going to think that all I want to do is sell, sell, sell. But if we go to your plan, step one is to look at our service and understand why people need that. And now we know that it's almost, well, not just almost, but it is doing a disservice. We're being bad people if we don't at least let people know that our service or product that can change their life exists.
Exactly. And you can do that in a way also that is part of your authority building and part of your expert positioning, which is on your podcast. You can talk about my journey as a business owner. When I was building my business, I went like this, and these are some of the clients that I interacted with. And you can just tell stories and talk about stuff and do it very casually. Like, you can kind of build that into your narrative. The other thing is, you're not going from just speaking on your podcast to just like selling someone your highest ticket, most expensive item, right? What you're probably going to do is say, hey, if you're getting value from this podcast and these conversations that we're having or this education that I'm putting out, I now also have this free white paper or video or whatever else it is, which you can get by going to this website and opting in. And now what you're doing is you're offering another piece of free value in exchange for someone's email, in exchange for the permission to market to them. And then you're going to kind of eventually move them through your funnel. So it's a step-by-step process.
Matt, one of the things that you mentioned was a funnel. You mentioned this idea of a lead magnet and a funnel. And I think of it as kind of like dating somebody in a way. Like when we go to the bar, for example, we go to the bar, the first thing that we do when we see someone who's kind of cute is not go and say, I'm handsome, you're handsome, we got to get together. Instead, you go and you might say, hey, what are you drinking? Or, hey, where are you from? Or do you live around here? And we'll just start by casually having that conversation. And it's like one step at a time, as if we were courting someone. And later on, we can go on a date. And after that, we can maybe go on vacation together. And after that, we might propose to that person, but we don't want to do it too fast, too soon. So I thought it was interesting when you said you don't always need to just share with them your biggest package. You can just give them that lead magnet, that free checklist or that free template or that free white page that you've created, which gets them to start seeing you as someone that they could date and marry later on down the road, which is, I thought that was interesting how you mentioned it. And I think you also mentioned know, like, trust with your podcast. Like, one of the reasons why Matt Bowles started the Maverick Show is because he knows that he needs his perfect audience, his perfect listener, this potential client, to know, like, and trust him. And I think of it as trademarked KLTI blueprint: know, like, trust, and then they invest. Just like with when we're dating, you got to slowly court and date, and then it's time for them to buy that package. And you said that one of the examples was that you just had this guy on your podcast. He came on your show, and then he knew somebody else who needed to get into real estate investing, and he put the two of you together. Have you had any other experiences with this know, like, trust, and eventually doing business with your company that you might be able to share a story with us?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, all the time. And a lot of times it happens in different ways as well, right? So this is what you want to be conscientious of, right? A podcast is a networking opportunity, not just a selling platform. Okay. And that can work in all different types of ways. So for example, I spoke by Southwest conference. This was before COVID, right? So 2019, spoke at the South by Southwest conference. And one of the people in the audience that came up afterwards to ask us questions was a guy I'd never met, never heard of him. He had heard every single episode of my podcast. So he knew me. He knew every single guest. He was citing the different guests and the different episodes, what his favorite episode was and all this kind of stuff. And then we went down to the bar. I said, come on, have a drink with us. So we all went down, we hung out, and all this kind of stuff. And then later that year, we were hiring for a major position at our company. So one of the things I did, I knew he knew our company really well. So I reached out to him. I said, hey, man, because we were connected on social media and stuff at that point after we met at South by. And so I said, hey, man, we got this position opening up if you know anybody that you think would be good. Now, he's a huge fan of our brand. He knows, likes, and trusts me. He's a big fan of our brand and the lifestyle and all this kind of stuff. And so he was able to refer in the person that ended up being the superstar candidate that we ended up hiring for that position.
Wow.
So it can work in a lot of different ways. You have to also understand the other great thing about a podcast is it gives you the opportunity, if it's an interview show, to reach out to people that you would otherwise have no business reaching out to. And,
100%.
And now all of a sudden you can say, hey, I host a podcast. Basically, I own a media platform and I want to help you get exposure and support and promote whatever it is that you're doing because I'm a fan of yours and I want to help you. Would you like the opportunity to come on my show and speak to my audience and all of that? Now, all of a sudden, you're building a relationship with somebody, and then that creates a network. And then you can go back to that person and say, hey, you were so amazing on my show. Who else do you know that you think would make a spectacular guest for the Maverick Show? I do that all the time. That's how I get some of my best guests.
You just shared a amazing, we'll call it a script. You just shared an amazing script with positioning yourself as an authority and at the same time offering someone else an opportunity to come on your show. And many of us, especially when we're new at this, we're scared shitless to do something like that. We're like, but nobody listens to my show, but I'm this, but I'm that. I'm not this yet. I haven't done this long enough. I'm brand new. Nobody's going to want to come on my show. Can you solve that problem for us with that script again?
So when you are brand new, you definitely have to put in some work to get your initial guests. So one of the ways you can do that is oftentimes through the existing network that you already have. If you're doing an interview show, by the way, there's a lot of podcasts that are not interview shows. You're just putting out content or something else. So if you're doing, like me, an interview show, what I did is I basically said, okay, who would be my first 10 guests that are already in my network. I know them personally, or I know somebody that knows them, and I'm pretty sure I could get them. And I feel like would be a solid first 10 guest rollout, because if I could interview those first 10 people, I feel like I would have 10 solid episodes that could really demonstrate the caliber of my show. And then people could listen to them. Then if people had any question about the quality of the show or anything else, they could just go listen to the first 10 episodes and they would be impressed, because I've spent the time selecting these first 10 people. And then from there, again, like I said, now all of a sudden you've interviewed those 10 people. So now you could go to those 10 people and you could say, hey, who else do you know that you think would be a spectacular guest for this show? And all of a sudden, those people are going to start introducing you to other people that they think would be amazing guests for your show. And you can just kind of grow it organically like that. And before you know it, you'll have 100 episodes. And now all of a sudden, you're a super experienced podcaster. And anybody that comes to look at your show and says, wow, this person has 100 episodes. They've been putting out an episode every week for over 2 years. Like, this is clearly an established podcast, definitely someplace that I want to go.
I have to say that with this podcast, the podcast on podcasting, I reached out to some of the top podcasters right in the very beginning. Like, I wanted that credibility right away. And it wasn't that difficult, to be honest. It was just, I used the pitch that you gave earlier, almost exactly. Like, I want to give you an opportunity to be in front of my audience. And I did it right in the beginning. What you just said was really interesting, because if we're afraid to do that right off the bat, we can just follow your 3-step process, because I believe that it opens us up and slowly gives us confidence one step at a time, where we start with the 10 people we know that are going to be great guests, and then asking them, who else do we know? And then the third step, being able to say, all right, I'm ready to go and ask Hal Elrod or whoever, to come on my podcast.
And I think just like with any type of sales process, and anybody that runs any kind of business at all is going to be familiar with this, the super majority of people are going to say no to anything that you're selling, right? So if you just condition yourself, say, okay, when I'm starting to reach out to cold, let's say, to these high profile people, I'm expecting at least 9 of the 10 to either not respond at all or to say no or whatever. But how can you increase that ratio? Well, one, obviously, if you know somebody that knows them, right, and you have a connection that introduces you, that's a huge one. Number 2, think about really specifically, how could you provide value to that person, and write them a customized invitation. So if someone is going to come out and publish a new book, or they have a new whatever that they're trying to promote and trying to get exposure to, you own a media platform and you have an audience that you are willing to expose them to for no cost to help them sell their product. That is inherently something that adds value. And so the extent to which you can position it in a customized way, not a generic way, not a template that you send the exact same one to 10 high profile people and say, hey, I'm a fan of yours. Do you want to be on my podcast? No. Write about specifically what it is. What piece of their work have you read or consumed, and what do you appreciate about them, and why do you want them on your podcast, and what does their work mean to you, and how has it impacted your life? And write them actually a very customized thing and say, I'm a huge fan, I've read all your books, and I saw you have a new one coming out. I've already bought it pre-sale. I'm excited to read it. And I was wondering if you'd like to have a platform on my podcast, and I would like to help you to promote it and introduce you to my audience and tell them what you've meant to me, and then give you an opportunity to share about your book and help you sell some copies.
Sounds like we can drop that mic again, Matt. Boom. Boom. One of the things that you mentioned just a few minutes ago, and I'm really wanting to get there, and you've just been adding and dropping value left and right. You mentioned that you can use stories in 2 ways, 2 types of stories, to position yourself and let people know almost under the radar what you do. One of the ways that you mentioned is using your own stories of your own, for example, real estate experience, or number 2, using stories of clients that you've worked with for their experience. Can you help us be a little bit better or know what to think of? Maybe there's 2 ways that you could help us build those types of stories into our regular podcast episodes so that we can do more business.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you got to think about why you're starting your podcast. Presumably, I mean, in the context we've been talking about this, you have some type of business and you sell a product or service, and you're going to do a podcast related to something about that product or service, which is the area that you know about. It's the area that you're passionate about. It's the areas that you're experienced and you're an expert in. And it's the area where you sell a product or service. So you may be having guests on your show that are in that space also. And then as you're talking with the guests, you're sharing stories, just like you would over a glass of wine or something like that. You're sitting around and the guest is telling you, oh yeah, when I was starting my business, or I was getting into this space or this industry, whatever it is, this happened to me. And then you can say, oh yeah, well, when I was, this happened to me and this and that. And this is how I got into it. And this is how I became passionate about it or whatever. And you're having a casual conversation with your guest. So people are getting to know you and you're positioning your expertise, right? Because you're in the space that is already your area of expertise. So you have this massive advantage. The other thing you could do is you could actually interview customers. Like if somebody is a longtime customer of your business and they've had success with your product, you could have them on your podcast and you could interview them. Like there's so many options for how you could do it.
Can you give us an example of interviewing a customer? So like maybe just use your business or my business for an example where what types of questions do you ask? How does it support you to do more business? What are you looking for and thinking about when you're asking those questions?
Yeah, so the person would be relevant. So for you, Adam, I mean, if your business is about starting a podcast, and that's what you're doing your podcast on, right? So anybody that has gone through your program and worked with you and went from having no podcast to starting a podcast to building their audience to selling their products to establishing themselves in the space and all of that, now all of a sudden they come back on your show and you say, hey, let's talk about this. And we go through all the same questions that you did with me, except that this is a person that actually kind of went through your program and had you by their side as they were doing it. And they can say, oh yeah, and Adam, that time when you told me about went to do this, it worked so well, man. And then it went this way and that way and all this kind of stuff. And so you just have the context there where they're telling their story and how they did it. But the overriding context is that you helped them to do it.
Good stuff. That was very valuable. One thing that I was thinking about, here you are, you're at Champagne Lake. You have your laptop, you've got your microphone that you traveled with. And not everybody does that, but there is somebody listening right now who wants to do their podcast from anywhere. You've been to 60 countries or 40 countries, something like that. And you're currently traveling. And you also, that's one of the things that you share with your listener for your podcast is that, look, you can own this real estate from anywhere. And so you've been really good at doing this yourself. And if our listener is thinking to themselves, like Adam, he's got a big old mic. It's attached to his desk. It doesn't move. He has a desktop, not a laptop, 3 monitors sitting here, all these lights and egg carton stuff all over the wall. I can't, unfortunately, take this whole room to a lake. So what are you doing as a traveling podcaster that our listener could benefit from?
It's a great question, Adam, because I knew before I started this podcast, I was already a digital nomad, meaning since 2013, I have had no permanent base. I got rid of my place. I got rid of my car. I got rid of my stuff. And I have been traveling the world, living in different places by choice for 8 years now. And I've lived in 65 countries since 2013. And I knew that I wanted to do the podcast and that was my lifestyle. So I asked exactly the same question to myself that you just asked. How the heck am I going to do that? So I will give you the very, very quick and easy answer. The first concern that I had was, what about Wi-Fi connection? I'm going to be in all these places and the Wi-Fi might be dicey. How am I going to deal with that? So I use a platform called Zencastr. There's another platform called Squadcast, and I assume there's probably a couple other competitors in the space by now. And what those platforms do is it allows you to come on. You can see each other on video like we can here. But when it records you, It records each guest audio track directly into their local device as if you're speaking from your microphone into your computer. So if we have Wi-Fi fluctuation, none of it's picked up on the audio track. So my audio track and your audio track, we get directly uploaded to the cloud after the interview. My editor will grab them from there. They're two pristine audio tracks by two people that just spoke into their computers, merge them together, and it's literally as if we were just sitting next to each other speaking into microphones. So that's the first hack and trick and the way that I get pristine audio quality during my interviews. And then the other thing in terms of equipment, I am using here today an ATR 2100. It's an Audio-Technica microphone, which is about the best value for money that you can get, I think, in terms of microphones. It's going to give you professional quality. It's not very expensive. And then that plugs into a Zoom H6 recorder, which I have here. And then the Zoom H6 recorder just plugs directly into my MacBook laptop, which is what I am talking to you on today. So those three pieces of equipment, a microphone, a Zoom H6 recorder, and a laptop is all you need. And you can travel the world, do a professional podcast, and never have any internet issues with your audio.
That was super, super helpful, especially if we're traveling. So you mentioned Squadcast, Zencastr, and a third one is riverside.fm. Those three links are now in the show notes. By scrolling down, you will be able to find this in the resources section of the show notes. Additionally, Matt mentioned his ATR 2100X, which is a $99 mic, super, super value, and a Zoom H6. I've also got the PodTrak P4 from Zoom, which is kind of like he's using an XLR cable in his ATR 2100X, even though it is possible to use a USB directly to the computer. The Zoom H6 gives him a little bit more options, and he can use that XLR cable. If you don't know what those are, it's cool. Look them up. There will be links if we have other podcasts that we go into more detail on that. And then just a laptop. So he uses Zencastr, or you could use Squadcast or Riverside, his laptop, and then his ATR 2100 into the Zoom H6. Awesome, awesome stuff.
I'll say just one more thing in terms of the reason why I have the Zoom H6. And one of the things that I love about it is I actually have a second microphone with a second XLR cable that I can plug into the Zoom H6 also for when I do an in-person interview. And one of my favorite things to do is an in-person interview. I just did my first one last week since the pandemic began, and it was delightful. We literally opened a bottle of wine. We drank through the bottle of wine during the interview. We sat under a tree outdoors, and we had our two microphones plugged into my Zoom H6, and we just recorded a podcast. So I love to do that whenever possible.
Matt, I assume that podcasting hasn't always been perfect and easy, and you didn't have 1 million listeners on day one. Out of curiosity, what do you do when something goes wrong? How do you approach it? How do you think about it? And how do you correct it?
Yeah, well, it depends what goes wrong. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong. For example, I have sometimes gotten through an entire interview with my guest talking into my microphone like this and assuming everything is recording properly, only to realize at the end that in fact my audio microphone wasn't on and I was somehow talking and my computer was picking it up in the distance and my audio track is basically unusable. And it was a spectacular interview. And what do I do now? And I've literally, for really good interviews where that happens, I've actually sat there and played it back and paused it during the parts where I'm going to speak and re-recorded just my audio and then had my editor just splice in my audio in each place when I had to just went through and re-record the entire thing. So like I have stuff like that goes on sort of all the time, but you learn from that. And then you have a checklist to like triple check, make sure your mic is plugged in and working the next time, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. Has there ever like that? That is so helpful. And I've done that once before. I've done it where my audio was just horrendous and I couldn't think of how to do it, but I did the exact same thing. And it was a bit of work because you have to I actually was the editor. I don't recommend that to anybody, but I just sat there and I had to record everything else that I said because I didn't want to lose it. So it was super good. Any other things that have gone wrong and maybe how you approach that situation?
Well, the beautiful thing about podcasting is, as you just mentioned, you can edit. So if there's anything that goes wrong during the interview, like the internet goes down and all this, I mean, I've done interviews. I know. I mean, I can tell you all kind of stories, man. I was doing an interview in Lagos, Nigeria. We're sitting there and all of a sudden the lights go out, the electricity goes out. We're like talking in the pitch black. Like, I mean, stuff happens all the time, right? And so you just need to be prepared. Say, okay, well, I have an editor. So if something goes on or this crashes in the middle or we have to pause for 15 minutes because some crazy loud thing just went on and we couldn't record or whatever, like, well, okay, great. So just pause, hang out, clip it out, and like, boom, your audience is never going to know because you just edit your podcast. And so I think the edit feature and being confident that you can always edit the podcast afterwards is really helpful.
If you started your podcast from scratch, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?
Oh, that is a good question. What would I do differently? I would probably get further ahead in terms of the number of interviews I had recorded before kind of going, because I think it can be stressful if you're trying to stay on a timeline, which, by the way, I recommend consistency. So if you want to really start building up your podcast, do it with a level of consistency. So whatever frequency you say you're going to do it. If it's a daily show, if it's a weekly show, if it's a monthly show, bi-weekly show, or whatever it is, make sure you do that. And sometimes it can get stressful if you're trying to like hustle around and get a guest because you got to put a show out next week and you don't want to miss a deadline. You got to find somebody to record them and this and that. So I would say recording a number of guests in advance and getting a good pipeline of guests there, and then keeping that buffer so that you don't get stressed about your podcast.
Really good information about like not being behind the eight ball, always kind of staying ahead of the game, making sure that you can easily be consistent. With your podcast, or I guess if you were to pour into a brand new podcaster, what are some of the top considerations that they should have as they're starting a podcast?
Well, think about specifically who your audience is, who your avatar is, who you're speaking to, and what you're trying to achieve. So I think having that level of clarity there, because there's going to be a bazillion podcasts in the space, like whatever space you're in, there's probably a lot of podcasts somewhere in there already. So what is going to be your niche? What is going to be your point of differentiation? What are you going to try to do with your show to laser target your audience and make your podcast different and interesting? So I would think about that first and have some clarity on that. And then also have some clarity on the business side of things. What are you going to do with this podcast? Where are you going to drive people? Are you going to have a specific offer? Say, hey, if you enjoyed the content on this podcast, you'll love to check out our free video series or our free report on this. You can grab it here, and just be consistently driving people there so that you can create some lead flow if that's your goal, and just sort of have that whole sort of vision and infrastructure sorted out. Like spend some time brainstorming through it, going through it, designing it, and making sure that you have it. Because some people, I think, will just jump in. They'll be like, hey, this is cool to record a podcast and have a conversation. Then I'm going to put it out to the world. And now what do I do? Like, don't be that person. Think about it first. Have your infrastructure there first, and then publish the podcast when you have an infrastructure to funnel people into.
The last question that I was thinking about is there anything that you've done, Matt, that's like helped grow your audience? Anything tangible that you could point to that has taken you from 1 listener to 10 listeners, or 10 to 1,000, or whatever it is that could be helpful for our listener so that they find a way to grow their audience?
Become a guest on other people's podcast. And then from there, start becoming a guest on larger podcasts with larger audiences. So this is going to be a process, but the more podcasts you're on, and the more podcasts you're on with bigger audiences, that's really going to be one of the best ways to grow your audience, because podcast listeners, you already know that they like listening to podcasts, right? I mean, there could be tons of people that are interested in your niche, but if they only read books and they don't like consuming the audio medium, that may not be a very good target for growing your podcast. But when you go to other people's podcasts, they've already cultivated an audience. They're basically giving you a warm introduction to their audience. And then you already know that their audience likes podcasts. because they're listening to you on a podcast. So that really is the best way. Be assertive about getting yourself onto other podcasts.
How do you go about that? Like, is there a website that you go to? Is there a certain pitch that you use? If you want to be a guest on more shows, because Matt Bowles just said that's how you grow your audience.
Yeah.
How do we go about doing that?
Well, I mean, if you're starting from scratch, you're going to do it yourself. And when you personally reach out, that's going to go a lot longer than having your assistant reach out. And especially if it's a higher profile person and you reach out yourself, that's going to really go a long way. What you want to do basically, though, is the same thing that we've been talking about the entire time here, which is you want to tell them how you're going to be able to provide value to them. So Adam, you and I are always looking for good guests for our show. If someone approached us and they said to either of us, hey, listen, I'm a big fan of your show. I listen to the show, and we know that they do. And I think that I would be able to add a whole bunch of value to your show and that'd be a spectacular guest. Here's why. Okay. I can talk about this, this, and this. So they know, and they're already going to know. They know that, Adam, that you ask these questions and they have a special story they want to share about this, or a special insight that maybe they haven't heard yet mentioned on your show they think would add value. And they're going to really give you a customized pitch why, Adam, I think that I would be a great guest for your show. And also, here are some other podcasts that I've been on where you can listen to me as a guest and see if you think I would be a good fit for your show. And if I get a pitch like that, and it's a pitch that I want to hear, like they say the things that compel me, that I'm like, wow, this person would be a guest. And I've certainly had guests on my show that cold pitched me and they were fans of the show. They knew me and they knew the show. I wasn't just a giant list of some generic thing they were like sending 100 emails to. And they specifically told me why they thought they would be a good fit for my particular show. And I agreed with them. I was like, wow, yeah, you have had some amazing experiences. I would love to hear some of those stories on my podcast. I've absolutely had guests on my show from that. And so remember that a podcaster is always looking for guests. That's part of the work that goes into a podcast, is finding a spectacular guest. If you're already a spectacular guest and you can just tell the podcaster, hey, I'm here, I'm a spectacular guest, and here's why, you have actually saved them work and delivered them value by presenting yourself to them as an ideal guest.
Matt, one of the things that I keep, it's almost like a theme of this episode, it's all about adding value.
Yeah.
It's like every pitch that you make, whether it's to get on your podcast or to have somebody on your show, you're always thinking, what can I do to entice them, to add value to them, to show them, to add value? And it's interesting that you're also doing that right now as you're on my show, as you're here with us, is you are focusing each and every time that I ask you a question, you're like adding value to the listener. And
right.
I think it's remarkable because a lot of people, they want to get on the shows and they're like, oh, I'm going to pound my chest. I'm going to show how cool I am. I'm going to just show how smart I am. But they never really tie it into the listener. You continue to tie it into the listener. And I would recommend to think that way, to take a page out of your book, Matt, as we want to be a better podcaster, a better salesperson, to have better guests on our show, to get on other people's shows, and to move somebody from one piece of the funnel to the next piece of funnel. We need to be thinking, what can I do to give something? I don't remember, is it Zig Ziglar who said, if you help enough other people get what they want, you'll have everything in life that you want.
Yep.
And it goes even into your business. As you're thinking about your company, as you help people get cash flowing real estate that already has a tenant ready to go, you are bringing it onto your podcast. You're thinking to yourself, this is the shit. I need to help people with this. They need to be able to get this. And you're thinking about them instead of thinking of yourself. And as we become podcasters and better podcasters and salespeople, that's what I want my listener today to take away, is you've got to be always adding value to everyone.
100% agreed.
Awesome. Awesome. Short and sweet. Matt, I appreciate you jumping on the podcast. I've got your podcast, The Maverick Show. The link is already in the show notes. The website, your website, is also currently in the show notes. Is there anything else that the listener needs to know to find you and get a hold of you?
If anybody wants to connect with me on Instagram, you can follow me at Matt Bowles Maverick. And just feel free to shoot me a DM. I love to hear from people. If you've heard this episode, shoot me a DM. Let me know what you thought about it. We'd love to connect.
Awesome. Matt, thank you for jumping on. And that's a wrap.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it.
This episode is brought to you by GrowYourShow.com. Grow Your Show lets you be the star of your show while we handle all the hard stuff. We offer reliable and affordable post-production services that allow you to grow your show organically without all the work. So go ahead and check out the website right now and feel free to schedule a call with me and let's take your show to the next level. Again, GrowYourShow.com. You just press record. We handle the rest.